I was ecstatic when my wife, Jenna, and I closed the deal on our new home. It was everything we'd hoped for, a charming colonial-style house nestled in a quiet cul-de-sac with a sprawling backyard and plenty of space for our two kids, Ellie and Max. It was a fresh start, a place where we could finally settle down and make new memories. The house wasn't perfect, of course. It had been vacant for several years before we moved in, and while it had been maintained reasonably well, there were still signs of age: peeling paint, creaky floorboards, and a faint musty smell that lingered in the upstairs hallway. We chalked it up to old house quirks and got to work making it our own. For the first week, everything seemed fine. We spent our days unpacking boxes, painting walls, and rearranging furniture. The kids were thrilled with their new rooms, and Jenna was already planning a garden for the backyard. But by the second week, I started noticing things that didn't feel quite right. It began with the upstairs hallway. It was long and narrow, connecting the 3 bedrooms and the bathroom. Something about it felt off, like it was colder than the rest of the house, even on warm days. The shadows seemed deeper there, stretching unnaturally across the walls. Jenna dismissed it, calling it my overactive imagination, but I couldn't shake the unease I felt every time I walked down that hall. Then there were the whispers. The first time I heard them, it was late at night. Jenna and the kids were already asleep, and I was in the living room unpacking boxes. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but the sound was too distinct, soft, overlapping voices, as though someone was having a muffled conversation just out of earshot. I froze, straining to hear, but as soon as I stepped into the hallway, the whispers stopped. I told myself it was nothing. Old houses make strange noises, I reasoned. It's probably the pipes or the floorboards settling. But the whispers continued, always at night, always in the hallway. They were faint, just barely audible, but they made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. One night, I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, I crept down the hallway, stopping outside each door to listen. The whispers seemed to be coming from Ellie's room. My heart pounded as I opened the door, half expecting to find someone, or something, inside. But the room was empty. Ellie was sound asleep, her small frame rising and falling with each breath. I stood there for a moment, feeling foolish, before quietly closing the door. The next morning, Ellie mentioned something that made my stomach drop. "Daddy," she said over breakfast, "I heard someone talking in my room last night." Jenna and I exchanged a glance. "What did they say?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Ellie shrugged. "I don't know. It was too quiet. But it sounded like a lady." Jenna laughed it off, suggesting Ellie had been dreaming, but I couldn't ignore the knot of unease forming in my chest. I decided to keep a closer eye on things, though I didn't tell Jenna. I didn't want to scare her, or worse, make her think I was losing my mind. The whispers weren't the only thing that unnerved me. The hallway seemed to have a presence of its own. Sometimes, as I walked down it, I'd feel a faint pressure, like someone was standing too close behind me. Other times, I'd catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to find nothing there when I turned. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They were soft, almost imperceptible, but distinct enough to jolt me awake. I sat up in bed, listening. The sound was coming from the hallway, slow and deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the bed and stepped into the hallway. The air was icy, the kind of cold that cuts straight to your bones. The footsteps stopped as soon as I opened the door, leaving the house in eerie silence. That was when I saw her. At the far end of the hallway, near the attic door, stood a figure. It was faint, almost translucent, but unmistakable, a woman in a long, flowing dress, her head tilted as though she were listening for something. I blinked, and she was gone. The next morning, I told Jenna what I'd seen. She was skeptical, of course, but agreed to call a priest to bless the house, just to put my mind at ease. The priest came that afternoon, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers as he moved from room to room. For a few days, things seemed normal again. The whispers stopped, and the house felt lighter somehow, less oppressive. But it didn't last. A week later, Max came running into our room in the middle of the night, tears streaming down his face. "There's someone in my room!" he sobbed, clinging to Jenna. I rushed into his room, my heart pounding. It was empty, of course, but the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. I checked every corner, every closet, but found nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That was the night the hallway door appeared. The house didn't have a door at the end of the hallway when we moved in. It was just a blank wall, painted the same neutral beige as the rest of the house. But as I walked down the hall to check on Ellie, I saw it, a narrow wooden door, slightly ajar, with darkness spilling out from the crack. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to turn around and leave. But I couldn't. Something was pulling me forward, an invisible force compelling me to step through the door. The room beyond was small and empty, its walls lined with faded, yellowed wallpaper. In the center of the room was a single chair, facing the wall. On the wall, scrawled in jagged black letters, was a single word: leave. I ran out of the room, slamming the door shut behind me. The next morning, the door was gone, replaced by the same blank wall that had always been there. Jenna didn't believe me when I told her. She thought I'd had a nightmare, or maybe a hallucination brought on by stress. But I knew what I'd seen, and I knew we had to get out of that house. The final straw came a few nights later. I woke to find Ellie standing at the foot of our bed, her eyes wide with fear. "She's in my room," she whispered. "Who's in your room?" Jenna asked, sitting up. "The lady," Ellie said. "She said it's her house." We packed our things and left that morning, moving in with Jenna's parents until we could find a new place. I never told the new owners about the whispers, the footsteps, or the woman in the hallway. I told myself it wasn't my problem anymore. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. When my partner, Emma, and I bought our first house, we were over the moon. It was a quaint Victorian-style home in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by towering oaks and manicured lawns. It needed some TLC, sure, but we were excited to put our mark on it. The previous owners had been an elderly couple who had passed away, and the house had been sitting vacant for a few years before going on the market. The basement was the only thing that gave me pause. The door to it was solid wood, reinforced with a heavy, rusted lock. The realtor said the previous owners had used it for storage and kept it locked because of flooding issues. The key, however, was nowhere to be found. At the time, it didn't seem like a big deal. We figured we'd hire a locksmith later to get it open. But in hindsight, I wish we had just left it alone. Our first week in the house was uneventful. We spent our days cleaning, unpacking, and discussing how we'd tackle renovations. By the second week, we started noticing odd things. Small stuff, at first, items going missing or turning up in strange places, faint knocking sounds coming from the walls, and cold spots that lingered in certain rooms. And the joke that the house had a personality. But the atmosphere felt heavier to me, especially in the evenings. The air in the house seemed denser, and shadows stretched longer than they should have, pooling in corners where the light didn't quite reach. The first real scare happened late one night. Emma had already gone to bed, and I was in the living room, scrolling through my phone. Out of nowhere, I heard a loud thud coming from the kitchen. I froze, my heart racing, and strained to listen. Another thud followed, this time louder, like something heavy had fallen to the floor. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a broom, and crept into the kitchen. The room was empty, but the back door was unlocked. I was certain I had locked it earlier. I checked the door and secured it, telling myself I must have been distracted and forgotten. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something odd. A thin layer of dirt covered the floor near the basement door, leading directly to it, as though someone had been dragging their feet across the tile. The basement door was still locked. The next morning, I told Emma about what had happened. She tried to brush it off, saying I was probably tired and imagining things, but I could see the unease in her eyes. We called a locksmith that day, determined to open the basement and put my mind at ease. When the locksmith arrived, he spent a good 20 minutes trying to pick the lock. Eventually, he sighed and said, "This is an old one. It's not just locked, it's been reinforced. You want me to drill it open?" Emma hesitated, but I nodded. "Yeah, do it." It took another 20 minutes of drilling before the lock finally gave way. The door creaked open, revealing a steep set of stairs descending into darkness. The air that seeped out was cold and damp, carrying a faint metallic smell. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped cautiously down the stairs. The basement was larger than I'd expected, with low ceilings and stone walls covered in patches of moss. There were shelves lined with dusty jars, stacks of old newspapers, and broken furniture scattered across the floor. But what caught my attention was the far wall. It was covered in scratches, long and jagged, as though someone, or something, had clawed at the stone. "Looks like they had an animal down here," the locksmith said, his voice echoing off the walls. I nodded, but I wasn't so sure. The scratches were too deep, too deliberate, and there were no signs of a cage or kennel. Just the claw marks and a faint trail of dirt leading to a small, square door built into the foundation. Emma and I decided to leave the basement alone for the rest of the day, telling ourselves we'd sort through it later. That night, I woke up to the sound of faint tapping. At first, I thought it was rain, but when I looked out the window, the sky was clear. The tapping grew louder, more insistent, and I realized it was coming from the floor. From the basement. I shook Emma awake, and together we crept downstairs. The tapping stopped as we reached the basement door, leaving the house eerily silent. "I don't want to go down there," Emma whispered, clutching my arm. "Me neither," I admitted. But I opened the door anyway. The basement was pitch black. I turned on my flashlight and shone it down the stairs, half expecting to see something waiting at the bottom. But the room was empty, just as we'd left it. We stayed up for the rest of the night, too afraid to go back to sleep. The next day, I tried to convince Emma to call a paranormal investigator, but she refused. "I don't want to know," she said. "Let's just leave it alone." I agreed, though part of me was itching to go back down and open that small, square door. I told myself it was just curiosity, but deep down, I knew it was something more. A few nights later, I woke up to find Emma standing at the foot of the bed, staring at me. Her eyes were wide, unfocused, and her skin was pale. "Emma?" I said, sitting up. "What's wrong?" "They're in the basement," she whispered. "Who?" She didn't answer. She turned and walked out of the room, heading for the stairs. I jumped out of bed and followed her, calling her name, but she didn't respond. When I caught up to her, she was standing in front of the basement door, her hand on the knob. "Emma, stop!" I said, grabbing her arm. She turned to look at me, her face blank and expressionless, and said, "We let them out." The next morning, she didn't remember anything. I told her what had happened, and she just stared at me, her hands shaking. We decided to sell the house that day. Before we left, I went down to the basement one last time. I couldn't resist. I had to see what was behind that square door. It took all my strength to pry it open. The space behind it was small, barely more than a crawl space, but the walls were covered in more scratches. And in the center of the floor was a pile of bones, old and yellowed, tangled with scraps of fabric. As I stared at them, I heard a whisper, soft and raspy, coming from somewhere deep in the crawl space. "Stay." I ran up the stairs and slammed the door shut, my heart pounding in my chest. We moved out that same week, leaving most of our belongings behind. I don't know who, or what, was in that basement, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the tapping again. And I wonder if we really left it behind. When my fiancée, Rachel, and I bought our new house, it felt like the start of the life we'd always dreamed of. It was a mid-century home with a sprawling yard, tucked away in a quiet neighborhood just outside the city. It was the kind of house you'd see on the cover of a real estate magazine, with large windows, polished wood floors, and a spacious layout perfect for starting a family. But there was one thing we hadn't expected: the room with the mirrors. The house had a small, square room on the second floor, tucked at the end of the hallway. The realtor had called it a bonus room, but Rachel and I couldn't figure out what it had been used for. The walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling mirrors, creating the unsettling illusion of endless reflections. It felt claustrophobic, like the room was closing in on itself. "I guess it could be a home gym?" Rachel suggested, though her tone was uncertain. I laughed nervously. "Yeah, maybe." We decided to leave it alone for the time being, focusing instead on unpacking and settling into the rest of the house. But the mirror room stayed in the back of my mind, nagging at me like a splinter I couldn't quite reach. It didn't take long for things to start feeling off. At first, it was small things, a misplaced item here, a strange noise there. Rachel joked that the house was still getting to know us, but the atmosphere felt heavier every day, as though the walls were closing in. The mirror room, in particular, gave me the creeps. Every time I walked past it, I felt like the reflections were watching me. Sometimes I thought I saw movement out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of motion that didn't match my own. But when I turned to look, the room was empty, just a cold, lifeless box of glass. One night, as we were getting ready for bed, Rachel asked me something that made my skin crawl. "Have you been spending time in the mirror room?" she said, brushing her hair. "No," I replied, confused. "Why?" She hesitated, her eyes narrowing. "I've seen you in there. A few times. Late at night." I stared at her, my stomach tightening. "Rachel, I haven't been in that room since we moved in." Her face went pale. "But I've seen you. Or someone who looks like you." We didn't say much after that, but neither of us slept well that night. The next morning, I decided to take a closer look at the mirror room. Armed with a flashlight, I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me. The air was cold, almost unnaturally so, and a faint smell of mildew lingered in the corners. I ran my hand along one of the mirrors, half expecting it to feel warm or alive. But it was just glass, cold, smooth, and ordinary. I tapped on it, my knuckles echoing faintly. Nothing seemed out of place. But then I turned off the flashlight. In the dim light filtering through the crack under the door, the mirrors seemed to shimmer, their surfaces rippling like water. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, as one of the reflections moved, just slightly, just enough for me to notice. It wasn't me. I was standing still, but the reflection tilted its head, its eyes locking onto mine. I stumbled backward, fumbling for the doorknob. The reflection's mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear, and for a brief moment, its expression twisted into something that wasn't human. The door finally gave way, and I bolted out of the room, slamming it shut behind me. I told Rachel what I'd seen, but she was skeptical. "Maybe it's just the lighting," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Or a trick of the glass." I wanted to believe her, but deep down, I knew something was wrong with that room. We agreed to keep the door shut and ignore it, focusing on the rest of the house. But ignoring it didn't make it go away. A few nights later, Rachel woke me up, shaking my shoulder. "I heard something," she whispered. I sat up, listening. The house was quiet, but the air felt heavy, charged with an unnatural stillness. "It's coming from the mirror room," she said, her voice trembling. I grabbed a flashlight and crept down the hallway, Rachel close behind me. As we approached the door, we heard it, a faint tapping sound, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone knocking from the other side. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the doorknob. "We should call someone," Rachel whispered. But before I could respond, the door creaked open on its own. The tapping stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. The room was dark, the mirrors reflecting faint glimmers of moonlight. As I stepped inside, my flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. The mirrors seemed to come alive, their surfaces rippling like liquid. Reflections of Rachel and me stared back at us, but they didn't move the way we did. They stood still, their eyes cold and empty, watching us with unsettling intensity. Then, one by one, the reflections stepped forward. pressing against the glass as though trying to break through. Rachel screamed, and I grabbed her hand, pulling her out of the room. We slammed the doors shut and pushed a dresser in front of it, barricading it as best we could. The tapping started again, louder this time, accompanied by faint whispers that seemed to seep through the cracks. We spent the rest of the night huddled in the living room, too afraid to go back upstairs. By morning, the whispers had stopped, but the air in the house felt heavier, oppressive, like the walls were closing in. The final straw came a week later. Rachel had gone to visit her sister for the weekend, leaving me alone in the house. I was watching TV in the living room when I heard a voice call my name. It was Rachel's voice. I froze, my heart racing. "Rachel?" I called out, knowing she wasn't supposed to be home. The voice came again, faint and distorted, echoing down the hallway. I grabbed a flashlight and followed the sound, my footsteps echoing in the silence. It was coming from the mirror room. The barricade was gone, the door wide open. The room was dark, but the mirrors glowed faintly, their surfaces alive with rippling light. My reflection stood in the center of the room, smiling at me with an expression I didn't recognize. "Come closer," it said, its voice a distorted echo of my own. I ran. Rachel and I moved out the next day, leaving everything behind. I don't know what was in that room, and I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, I catch my reflection lingering a little too long, its eyes watching me with a knowing look. And I wonder if I ever really left that room.